everyone, my name is Josselyn Donahue, and I'm in the biology department at Westfield State University in Massachusetts. My project is entitled Speaking the Truth of the Eugenics Movement Horror Stories in the Age of Genetic Engineering. I want to go into the genetics field after graduation, and for this project, I wanted to look into the United States eugenics movement of the 20th century. This was something that I hadn't learned about until I got to college, and many of my friends hadn't heard about it either. I wanted to research this topic to have a better understanding of the injustices that happen to people without their knowledge, and to draw similarities and to bring caution to today's genetic engineering. To start, genetics is the field that examines how traits are passed from generation to generation. Eugenics is the science of improving a human population by controlled breeding in order to increase the occurrence of desirable traits. The eugenics movement was a movement that tried to improve the genetic composition of the human race, and genetic engineering is deliberately and directly modifying an organism by manipulating its genetic material. It's good to keep these concepts in our heads as we go through this presentation. And before I dive into it, I just want to clarify that I'm using terms that I found in my research. Some of the terminology isn't necessarily politically correct, and I don't mean to offend anyone with any of the terms that I use. They're just what were used during the time period, and they're pertinent to the research and to the project, so thank you for understanding that. Okay, so the eugenics movement, or even the idea of eugenics, began with Francis Galton when he wrote Hereditary, Character, and Talent in 1865. Here he traced 330 renowned men and showed that many of them were in fact related. He described how many people who would have died due to natural selection were preserved, and this halted the ability of man to keep improving himself. He came to the conclusion that talent and character were heritable just like physical features. Galton later went to coin the term eugenics in 1883. So in his book and in his thinking, he referred to mankind as a wild species basically, and implied that we should let people who are so-called less fit face natural selection and die off instead of implementing care for them. And that was a radical idea then and still is now. In 1882, the United States passed an immigration law which banned what they called undesirables. This term categorized people who were convicts, lunatics, idiots, or unable to care for themselves. Now, this was also a fear tactic because at the time, the immigration rates were rising in the United States, and many people were worried that non-Western and non-Anglo-Saxon people were entering the country. This law was discriminatory about who was allowed to enter the United States and used the term undesirables, which became a common theme in eugenics and sterilization laws throughout the movement. In 1893, the Kansas State Asylum for Idiotic and Imbecile Children implemented a castration program. The superintendent at the time, F. Hoyt Pilcher, believed that sexual surgery could be a treatment for the mentally ill. During this time, 44 males had their testicles removed and 14 females had hysterectomies, and the average age of these patients was 20 years old, and these patients did not know that they were being sterilized. At this time, many eugenics journals and societies were being formed with the intent to educate people about eugenics, evolution, optimal development conditions for the maintenance of the human race, and the cost of protecting the weak. These ideas were circulating not just in the United States, but also many parts of the world, including Germany, where Hitler was in charge of their eugenics movement. These people wanted to prove that certain undesirable traits could be eliminated from the human race through selective breeding and sterilization of undesirables. In 1907, Indiana was the first state to pass the compulsory eugenic human sterilization law. This law made sterilization mandatory for criminals, idiots, rapists, and imbeciles in state institutions. The doctors in the institutions really thought that they were helping these patients. In order for the sterilization to occur, 2 surgeons needed to give approval, and they both had to decide that there was no chance of the patient's mental improvement with other treatments. This is important because it shows that the so-called treatment was used as a last resort to try to help these patients. However, this law created a domino effect that led to 31 other states passing sterilization laws. California passed its sterilization law in 1909, and it stayed in place for 70 years. This law resulted in 20,108 people being sterilized without their knowledge. In 2018, California considered giving compensation to those sterilization survivors. Washington and Connecticut also passed their sterilization laws in 1909. Washington's was aimed solely at criminals, and Connecticut's allowed sterilization of people in state prisons and state hospitals. Connecticut laws had a penalty of $1,000 and jail time for unnecessary operations. And I just think that's a little ironic because in my opinion, and I'm sure in yours too, all of these operations were unnecessary. Nevada passed its law in 1911 for men charged of sexual crimes. Iowa passed its law in 1911 to prevent procreation of habitual criminals, idiots, imbeciles, and the feeble-minded. New York passed its sterilization law in 1912 and targeted people with undesirable traits in state institutions. So by now I'm sure you're seeing a trend. These laws aim to sterilize people who are criminals, idiots, rapists, imbeciles, degenerates, the insane, and other people who have these so-called undesirable traits in order to prevent more of them in our society. And I can't stress it enough. These people did not know they were being sterilized. Their doctors would tell them they were just doing a simple procedure, but in reality, they were sterilizing them without their knowledge, and it's just so unjust. The rest of the states that had sterilization laws were North Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, Oregon, South Dakota, New Hampshire, Idaho, North Carolina, Alabama, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Montana, Virginia, Utah, Maine, Mississippi, West Virginia, Arizona, Vermont, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Georgia. Many of these states had their sterilization laws repealed fairly quickly, 15 years, due to their unconstitutionality. Yet there were still modern instances of eugenics practices. From 2006 to 2010, California prisons authorized 150 female sterilizations. However, the Eugenics Compensation Act was passed unanimously to help those who suffered from forced sterilization. The eugenics movement showed how scientists tried to use selective breeding, a form of manual genetic engineering, to make what they deemed undesirable traits disappear from the human race. This was still 25 years before Rosalind Franklin and Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA. So we've come so far in genetic technology to the point now where we're able to repair, disable, insert, or remove sections of DNA in a person. This is possible with the CRISPR-Cas9 technology. It has been used safely and successfully to genetically engineer numerous organisms, including cattle, pigs, mosquitoes, and many others. This technology, CRISPR-Cas9 genetic engineering, is aimed at erasing genetic diseases for the advancement of the human race. We need to understand what happened in the eugenics movement to truly be aware of the possibilities of genetic engineering. If we're able to erase genetic diseases from humans, what would be next? What would we try to eliminate then? In the eugenics movement, they tried to eliminate people with mental disabilities. So is that what scientists today would deem as undesirable and fixable? Where do we draw the line with what is considered an undesirable trait, characteristic, or condition today? This is what we need to think about as we enter the age of genetic engineering. Not even 100 years ago, scientists tried to purify the human race as they saw fit. We need to be careful with the power that we have now because we abuse the power we had then. Thank you.